o'clock, and I will call this meeting to order. We'll start with public comment. Issues items that are not on the agenda may be raised by the public at this time. Citizens should speak from the podium. Begin by stating your name. Limit remarks to less than 3 minutes. Committee members may request that a discussed item be placed on future agenda. The committee takes public comment on all regular agenda items during the discussion of those items. Is there any public comment? Being there is none, we will move on to the consent agenda. On the consent agenda, we will consider approving the August 17th, 2017 Animal Shelter Advisory Committee regular minutes. Has everybody had a chance to look those over? Anyone have any changes they'd like to make? So they'll stand approved as read. As written. On to the regular agenda. First item is discussion and possible action related to monthly shelter numbers for August of 2017. Morgan?
Good afternoon. What I have before you today are the figures for our intake and disposition of all the animals that we had excuse me, in August 2017. I did add some additional information because there was discussion last meeting about drilling into the numbers a little further, and so I wanted to have that opportunity before the committee today. Of course, I do want to point out that there were 0 adoptable pets euthanized in August. That makes 17 months in a row into our no-kill initiative. I also want to highlight that we had 132 citizens using our microchip clinic, and that is stellar. You'll see that those numbers are often, 5 to 6 citizens using that that clinic. Going into kind of a media blitz that we did in June and July, we were getting 20 to 30 citizens coming in and having their personal animals microchipped. But because of the Clear the Shelter adoption event, which went beautifully, we had a ton of people come in to use the microchip clinic in addition to all the other things going on at the shelter that day. So of the 132 microchips that we administered in August, and this is not for adopted pets, this is simply for privately owned pets, 114 of that was because of Clear the Shelter. And so we expect that September will be back down in the 20 to 30 range, so still healthy, but we would like to do those all day long. Unfortunately, still so many of the animals coming into our facility as stray are still not microchipped, and so we want to encourage folks to know about the service that we offer at the $13 for the life of the pet. It's a really great deal. So that's where we are on those numbers. Into the new arrivals for August, our intake was about 611 animals. 300 of those were adopted. 88 of those adoptions were due to the Clear the Shelter adoption event. So a huge turnout there. It was also a record month for cat adoptions. We've been doing a big push on cats lately because they just simply don't move as quickly as the dogs do, and we want to make sure that folks know that we have a lot of really great options in cat ownership at our facility. So we're grateful to Contra Valley Paws for their partnership on that. We also had 55 of our animals redeemed by their owner. So these were animals that went back to their original owner. They were either reunited through a microchip, a lost and found situation, whatever it may be. We did unfortunately euthanize 300 animals. That was largely, of course, they were animals that were identified as feral, injured, sick, or aggressive. I do have greater numbers in the drill down of that. First by disposition, how many were because they were feral, how many were because they were sick, but also into by species in just a moment. So that left 282 animals left in our shelter. We do get a little nervous when we're approaching 300 animals in the shelter. Depending on how many are cats, how many are livestock, whatever it may be, we do run out of space, and we do have to kind of move mountains and do a real big push for with PAWS support for more adoptions or transports out, whatever it may be. And so in September, we did have a lot of relief that you'll see at our next time that we discuss numbers. So with those figures there, that meant that we had a live release rate of 65%, meaning of the animals that arrived, 65% were released alive, whether redeemed by their owner or adopted. So to drill down into the euthanasia, just to really understand what's going on with that, is that we were unfortunately euthanizing 300 animals in the month of August. Of that, 196 were cats. We talk about this occasionally, that the vast majority of our euthanized animals are cats, and you'll see in a moment why. Some of it is due to the large volume of feral cats that are still coming into our facility that are not microchipped, not ear-notched, no way to determine where they belong. Also, they're getting sick, coming in sick or getting sick in our facility. So the vast majority of our euthanized pets were cats. You'll see about 81 were dogs, and then other. So about 23 were wildlife and livestock that happened there. We had a rooster come in that was injured beyond any care, and so we were forced to euthanize him as well to treat him humanely. So another way to break down that 300 number is in this way. So of the 300 that were euthanized, 148 because they were sick, injured, or failure to thrive. We had one that we put down due to failure to thrive, and that's a situation where a kitten came in without his mother. Often we try to match that with volunteers or PAWS staff who can bottle feed. This one was one that was too far gone. He had been away from his mom for too long. So unfortunately, that is what that category means. So 137 were sick, 10 were injured, and then one failure to thrive. So 148 due to sick or injured. Then we had 74 that we euthanized because they were feral. Of course, we scanned for microchip to be compliant with the free-roaming community cat ordinance, that we try to get those back into the colony where they belong. Unfortunately, there are many feral cats that don't belong to a colony or aren't microchipped or ear-notched or tattooed in that way. So it's 74 feral that we put down. That was all cats. Then we had 50 that we put down, and we categorized that as either aggressive or due to bite quarantine, which we are going to talk about in depth and a little more in a moment. But in the event that your animal is quarantined for a bite, or a stray animal is quarantined because it bit somebody and broke the skin, at the end of its quarantine period, which is 10 days, we assess that animal. And if the owner doesn't want to take that liability back on by taking that dog out of the facility, we do identify it as an aggressive animal and put it down at that time. We also euthanize 20 wildlife, and that is these 20 skunks here. Unfortunately, skunks are one of the top 5 carriers for rabies, and when a citizen catches them in a trap, there's no way to safely transport them without them spraying, without our staff being subject to injury in that way. And so we do euthanize skunks when we interact with them. And then 8 were owner requested. So that would be a euthanasia that was not one of our residents, but was a family that has an elderly pet or whatever, and they're looking for a cost-effective way to do the humane thing for that animal and have them euthanized. So that is our 300 euthanized pets.
Morgan, I have a question. On the sick animals, was there any common illness? I mean, did we have any type of outbreak in the shelter, or was there a citywide issue that we're seeing that caused that much sickness?
We are, of course, daily doing assessments on the animals in our facility for their health and wellness. We do regularly still see signs of parvo, unfortunately. Many of the dogs that you see adopted were either because of aggression that you see on the next page or because of signs of parvo. So we do see that quite often in our facility. They're either coming in with it or, unfortunately, catching it in our facility. We are taking, so there's some facility limitations that we have that retain disease in the porous surfaces, and we're working on that. I hope to have something to y'all soon about an overall facility assessment about, how do we have sealed surfaces, how do we do a better job of controlling disease. In addition to the sick and injured that were put down, parvo's some of it, but a lot of it is upper respiratory infection, that the air quality for the cats in particular is such that they are reinfected. And so we have cats that come in with it, And we also have cats that are that we don't catch it soon enough, and then they're getting it while they're there. And so those are the two most common diseases that we continue to see. To say an outbreak, it's something that we're constantly assessing, meaning that if I have 300 animals in the facility and I see an animal that has parvo, we try to deal with that very quickly so that it doesn't spread to the other residents. So to say, do we have an outbreak, I would categorize it as no. We have not had an outbreak in a disease. It's simply those recurring things that are common in our community, I think Dr. Schultze could speak to, and also are just common when you have communal living of animals. So
I would like to make
if that answers your question.
I'd like to make a comment as far as the parvo and the respiratory disease. The parvo disease actually has about a 7 to 10 day incubation period, so the pet could be non-symptomatic upon presentation, and during those 7 to 10 days, they'll actually be shedding the virus and potentially spreading it around the shelter without anyone knowing it. So in the sense that it could spread from the next stall over or with another littermate that wasn't exposed to it when it came in, but could be in the same part of the shelter at the same time, then that would be one way of spreading it. The other way, as far as the air quality issues, like Morgan was talking about, the facility is definitely needs for some TLC, and a lot of the problem is that those diseases can be silent and can start out kind of mild, just a clear snot, sneeze. If anyone's been out at the shelter, they can vouch that while they do a lot of cleaning, there's still a lot of irritants in the air that can be, especially in the cat room, because there's use of pine shavings and litter. Sometimes that can irritate cats and make them sneeze. So it's hard to really distinguish sometimes early signs of that infection, and then that's how it can spread. Outbreaks usually in the shelter are limited to if you may have a small outbreak, which would be parvo, which usually is just the newly vaccinated dogs. It takes about 21 days for the vaccine to be fully effective, and if they're under 5 months old, their vaccine status may be challenged because they have to get multiple vaccines to actually develop immunity to it. So it is not necessarily a failure of the vaccine, but the pet's still trying to develop their early immunity. So that's one way of young dogs catching parvo. And it's not really an outbreak per se, but it does happen, and it's just one of those unfortunate parts of shelter work that kind of does occur. The diseases that are usually considered outbreak status are going to be your canine influenza, which is not here locally. It's usually found in more metroplex areas that are a little bit higher pet population than we are here. And then canine distemper and parainfluenza are a lot more common. Usually the parainfluenza is the one that is a little bit more frequent. We also have a little bit of a more uptake of mycoplasma, which is bacteria which is not vaccinated for. Mycoplasma causes respiratory diseases, and unless you actually do about a $30, $50 test on it, you're not going to be able to distinguish it clinically from the others because it's basically done off of a PCR, which is a type of laboratory test. And distemper, which is the outbreak that happened earlier in the year, that is actually considered an outbreak, but those are not very common, especially as good as vaccine rate as they do upon intake. So unfortunately, that's just one of the things that can happen. So when Morgan's saying that there hasn't really been technically an outbreak, she's not lying. But respiratory diseases such as parainfluenza and the mycoplasma do occur, and in high-stress situations, they can lead to that being spread a little bit more easily. But if you're healthy enough, you usually can fight them off. But if you're under high-stress situations, which is why there's called a kennel cough complex, which is more appropriate, that's when you're going to see the coughing and hacking. And sometimes they get to where they're to a severe point where it might be that they can't isolate them into an isolation room, or they're beyond treatment and they're either very severely ill and they're not going to recover from it because it's basically a very severe pneumonia or things like that. So I would agree with Morgan's statement and say that there has not been an outbreak at the shelter in a long time. Well, at least since the beginning of the year.
And that brings up a couple extra points. This is an important issue to delve into and forgive me if your question's already been answered, but I do also want to point out that we are still vaccinating on intake. And so when an animal arrives, we're vaccinating cats with their specific vaccinations, and we're also vaccinating dogs. So, but it's the incubation period that's really detrimental to us, meaning that even upon vaccination, it takes several days for the inoculations to be completely effective. And so if an animal arrives and it's incubating a disease and we vaccinate against it, then that didn't help that animal. And so we continue to, and it's quite an investment each year in our budget to vaccinate on intake, but we see it as important because the illness rate, the euthanasia for sick, injured, failed, is not a number that we're comfortable with. And it would almost certainly be larger if we weren't vaccinating on intake. So I did want to reiterate to the committee and to the public that we are vaccinating on intake. We kind of talked about some facility issues. There is one thing that I'm working on is a complete facility assessment that we have a tremendous investment out there in a multi-million-dollar facility that in large part is doing what it's supposed to do. But we recognize that daily we're limited by our facility. We're limited in space. We're limited in isolation rooms. We're limited in a lot of ways. And so although there's not a lot of money to throw at that facility, I'd like to know what is the master plan of what we should be doing? What are the things that we should be addressing? And if it's HVAC, and I should have better air quality, and I should have more fresh air, more returns per minute, lots of things that I've never thought about before, but are important when you're in these airborne diseases. One thing that we tried temporarily, just kind of as a Band-Aid, as a stopgap, is we installed one of the Guardian air units in the tame cat room when you first walk in. So it's constantly emitting hydrogen peroxide in the air, so it kills anything that hydrogen peroxide uses. Y'all may be familiar with it. People have them in their homes if they have a kid that's asthmatic or if you have an older person that has COPD. It's just something that helps with air quality. And so it's working in the tame cat room. If I can get a cat processed out of isolation into the tame cat room, we're seeing a lot of improved health in that room in particular. But I've got cats more places than that, and so I need to be able to keep them healthy, and we're exploring options like that because we don't want the facility to be our enemy. There are things that we know need to be improved, and we're working on that. We also implemented on Thursday a new cleaning system. We bought a new chemical to apply to the general population, to the facility as a whole, that quite frankly kills more disease. And so we've had a lot of success with that already. We're getting lots of good feedback about how it's working, and we do, and it was largely at the same cost of what we were using.
What is that, just out of curiosity's sake?
It's called ProVet Logic. There are several facilities that I visited with that are using it. It's designed in such a way, and forgive me, all I know we're getting off on a tangent here, but I think it makes sense about the numbers that, bleach only kills certain diseases.
Yes.
Ammonia kills some diseases. The product I've bought is something that kills both. So anything that's airborne, it's really not going to speak to, but anything that's on a hard surface, it is killing, it is cleaning. That's my cue. I've been talking too long, so I forgive me. And just one thing to wrap it up is that we recognize that if we have healthier animals, we're going to be talking about capacity issues. We adopted this no-kill initiative. We do not want to euthanize any adoptable pets, and we haven't. But some would define a no-kill initiative as a 90% release rate. We're not there yet. But if we were, I would be full. I would be full every day. And we're having those discussions of, what do we do when our population's healthier and we need to adopt more out? In 2015, before the No-Kill Initiative, we adopted about 1,600 animals out. In 2016, where we adopted the No-Kill Initiative very early on, we adopted out about the same, 1,600. And so what we're recognizing is there's a finite number of customers in our community. So we're already just beating the drum on transports. We're doing so much adoption. We're doing all of these things, but where did these animals go? And the easy answer is they don't come in at all. We spay neuter. We spay neuter like crazy. So as far as our intake and what's going on with that, we've got some global issues that we need to speak to, but the micro of it all, I think, is a good, valuable conversation for us to have.
Anyone have any questions? The next item is discussion and possible action related to animal control procedures for bite cases.
Oh, did we need to do public comment on the intake?
Yeah. Any public comment?
Yes, Bob Salas, Citizen Angelo. I want to congratulate Paul's on a great event. Cleaning out the shelter was an awesome event, and you can see the numbers were huge for adoptions. Incredible numbers. I've never seen them before. Great numbers on microchips. Of course, now they've set a benchmark. We hope you can continue. We'll have 300 numbers. So thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you. For your next agenda item, this is what I hope is the first of many. One thing that I was tasked with when I came on board was to evaluate every procedure, look for any improvements that could be made, look for any changes that we might consider. And so I've been doing that. And so it's largely been a trial by fire situation. So the reason I'm bringing bite cases before you today is because we're dealing with a lot of them, unfortunately. And so one of the things that I'm doing just as a background for all of these SOPs is that I have a standing meeting just about every week with Judge Gilbert at Municipal Court and Deborah Womack, who's our municipal prosecutor. We are delving into the law. We are reading our ordinances. We are reading our policies. We are reading the state health code, all of the things. And we are identifying lots of questions, lots of recommendations, lots of ideas, and it's been a really valuable dialogue. And so as we had several bite cases come up, we did want to go ahead and get a standard operating procedure on the books that our animal control officers could follow, because it does become quite complicated quite quickly. So to really clarify, the state health code, Title 10, Chapter 822 governs if a dog bites a human, and we define a bite as it broke the skin, okay? Because we exist to prevent the spread of disease, because rabies is the thing that can go from animals to humans, it's what we're watching for, and that would happen through a puncture bite, not a glancing blow. So it really only speaks to dogs on humans. I want to really point that out. But in the city ordinance, it's our option to locally implement something that's more restrictive than the state. And so for that, it does include any animal biting or scratching, having a puncture wound on a human. It also includes any animal having a bite or a scratch or a puncture wound on another animal. Which quite frankly wasn't clear in the code. The city is going through an overhaul in general of their ordinances and taking them systematically to the council for consideration. I've raised my hand and said, I'm next. We need to talk about the city ordinance as it relates to animal intake, control, everything. The ordinance has been through several incarnations, meaning that we changed this one language and we didn't look over here where this other language was impacted by it. And so we're finding some things where it's just not congruous and it needs to be brought in line. And so that's something that we started delving into last week. We're going to continue to make those edits, those recommendations, and as we get to a stopping point with those, they'll be coming to this committee for consideration.
So right now, according to the city code, if let's say an iguana, which is kind of the most dangerous thing that's not a mammal that I see probably that can bite significantly. If a iguana was to bite a human, which an iguana can carry rabies. It's a strict mammalian disease that technically is supposed to be quarantined according to the law.
It is, and that's something we would identify as needing to be addressed. If the intent is to prevent the spread of rabies, let's write the law in such a way that it does that. So admittedly, this SOP that's before you today needs some work, but it's because the law needs some work. So we're very clear on what the state health code says, and so I still thought it was valuable to bring to you. It's also an SOP that we've still rolled out to our animal control officers that's new and that they are working through. So, but we expect that we're gonna bring some edits as we go.
And just as a general comment for the general public listening, the rabies is spread strictly through mammals. So anything that is a mammal that can bite you that appears to be rabid could possibly spread it, but it will not be spread by anything that is not a mammal species. So just to let y'all know.
Yes, sir.
So Morgan, city ordinance requires then if a dog bites another dog, that it's quarantined for the 10-day period? Okay.
Okay, so if we could kind of carve these out and treat them separately, the state health code is very specific. If we get a call for a bite incident, we go to the location to conduct an investigation. The state says it has to be a person bitten by a dog out of its enclosure. Well, what if your dog bites your child? That it's not out of its enclosure. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's covered under city ordinance. So the state only allows for us to investigate if a person was bitten by a dog out of its enclosure. Okay. At that time, we get written statements from the victim, the witnesses. Oftentimes, we're working to get those after the fact because if somebody was bit in such a way that it requires immediate medical attention, we encourage them to do that first, and we'll catch up with you later, right? It's also our task to photograph the victim's wounds. Occasionally, we run into issues where the doctor says, you cannot come into the emergency room and photograph the wounds. I'm not allowing it. Fine, we made our attempt. Oftentimes, police arrive on the scene first, and so they may have already photographed it before we get there, and we say, great, we'll get your pictures. We just don't want to put that victim through more stress than they really have to be. We also are there to photograph the dog as well. Okay. Then we write the report of the investigation. We notify the owner of the dog that they have to quarantine within 24 hours. And I apologize, I'm getting ahead of myself a moment, but in city ordinance, it says if you don't quarantine within 24 hours, we can cite you for every hour non-compliant. And state code says that if you don't quarantine within 24 hours, the municipal court can issue a seizure warrant for us to come in and seize your dog at that point. That's not very common, but we need that language in place because sometimes under the threat of a seizure warrant being issued, that's the final impetus for someone to finally impound their dog. They were not really willing to do that until they were made aware of the law that you can be issued a citation, you can be issued a warrant. And so by having those things in place helps prevent things getting to that level quite frequently.
Morgan, is there any kind of exemption for police service animals?
That is a good point, and there is, I think in the city ordinance, that if it's a duly certified canine military or law enforcement, that there is a different set of rules for that. Also, if it's serious bodily injury, you have to get a seizure warrant. We had lots of questions about what serious bodily injury meant. We interpret that locally as if it required stitches. So at that point, the animal control authority, who is me, would determine if the dog is dangerous. If the dog is dangerous, we have to notify them by letter. We will notify them, of course, in person or by phone first. Because in the event that it does get declared as a dangerous dog, it becomes quite cumbersome for the owner. For example, at that point, and gosh, I must have missed it, the municipal court would issue a seizure warrant if the animal is determined dangerous. So that means that, ordinarily when it goes into a quarantine period, it's 10 days. But if the court has issued a seizure warrant, we keep that dog until the court says you may release it. So it could be quite some time. And that will come up here. So the owner has 30 days to do the following. They must restrain the dog in a secure enclosure. Easy. They have to obtain a $1 million liability insurance policy, which scares a lot of folks. And they must comply with all city ordinances. And what I mean by that is they have to spay neuter. It's the ordinance. They have to microchip. It's the ordinance. They have to all of the things that are required. So oftentimes, it's rare that it escalates to this level because if an owner quarantines their dog, let's say we get to this step. The owner quite frankly, usually knows if they have a dangerous dog, that this is not the first such incident. They're scared to take that dog back into their home. I'm scared to release that animal back to the community, and at that point, the owner often opts to surrender their animal at the end of the 10-day period, and then the animal is euthanized. And so it's not common that a dog is declared dangerous, but that is the state code practice that we would follow in the event that that does happen. Also, the owner of the dog has the opportunity to appeal, so you can see that in this process, it can be quite some time that that animal's in my facility. Luckily, we haven't run into that in quite some time. Usually, the owner, once it reaches that level, says, you know what, I agree that, you know, if I have to carry $1 million liability insurance policy on my dog, it's probably not a dog that I need to keep. And so they do opt to euthanize at that point many times.
Just quick question. Is there, I mean, obviously it sets, you know, the conditions to release the dog, but is there a time limit on that release? Is it like after 3, 4, 5 years? Is that expired, or is that a permanent marker on the dog?
They have
Being a
to
dangerous
annually
dog.
renew these items. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Each year, they have to prove to the court. Each year, they have to annually report to the court and apply. They have to annually apply to the court to prove that they still have a current, all of those things.
Okay, I was just a little unclear on that.
Thank you.
How about the definition of quarantine? Is that only your facility, or can they use a vet?
It is not. In the city ordinance, which I didn't spend a lot of time on today because we need to edit it, but in the city ordinance, there are basically 3 opportunities for quarantine, okay? One is to come to my facility for 10 days. There is a $10 fee for the daily care of that animal, so that would be $100 at the end of the time. There is a $36 impound fee, and so it's $136 to redeem your dog at the end of this period for a quarantine in my facility. You also have the option to quarantine through your veterinarian if they offer that. Some vets in town don't, but you can opt to do that as well. It will almost certainly be more expensive than what we offer, so most folks do opt to come to our facility. In the event that you do quarantine at your veterinary's office, then we will follow up to ensure that you did do that. We will follow up with the veterinarian to make sure that they're well versed in, you know, this animal cannot be exposed to other animals. It cannot be exposed to people. Only the person caring for it, providing food and water, you know, those types of things. We just make sure that they're current on what's going on with all of that. There is a third option, a seldom used option that's available for a home quarantine. So a home quarantine can be authorized at my discretion as the local rabies control, and it's approved in very seldom situations. So one situation where it would be approved is, for example, if you have an animal-on-animal bite. There is a dog that attacks another dog. The victim dog had to seek medical attention for its injuries. It has stitches. It's injured. Well, that animal has to be quarantined as well in case it was exposed. But I would often authorize a home quarantine because that animal's injured and needs to be in its home recovering in a non-stressful situation. Some of the questions I'm going to ask if you're requesting a home quarantine is your rabies current? Your rabies certificate? Are you microchipped? Are you spayed neutered? If you can show in those ways that you have you're a responsible pet owner, then I can make that conclusion that you're also going to be a responsible rabies quarantine, because you can't let your dog out to your dog has to be quarantined in a room. It can't interact with your family members. You go in, you feed it, you check its health, you leave. It can't be just continue to be a member of your family. It has to be a very strict protocol. And so there are a few seldom cases where I do approve a home quarantine, but I had actually considered removing that language from the ordinance because it's so often abused. And in the event that a known bite dog got out, then that would be, quite frankly, egg on our face. We want to keep the public safety, and that's a way that sometimes is abused. So there are essentially 3 ways to quarantine your animal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And they do follow up. I will say that.
A lot. So to just hit on city ordinance very briefly, I included the section about bite cases in your background, but it needs some improvement. And so just to very briefly talk about what city ordinance does, it does add the requirement for any animal that bites or scratches, which breaks the skin, so not just dogs, as I mentioned. It also allows for animal bites or scratches, which we spoke about just a moment. And it also talks about declaring an animal a nuisance. So under the state code, you can have an animal declared dangerous. But there's specific language in the ordinance about declaring an animal a nuisance, and so that can be somewhat different. The nuisance clause may be something y'all are more familiar with, where if you have a barking dog complaint, if you have a dog that barks incessantly, that's your neighbor, you can get a log form from municipal court, you can state they're barking at all hours of the day and night, you turn it in, they can have the dog declared a nuisance. It's the same section of the code, which I'm a little allergic to because they're such different things, meaning that a dog that's a nuisance that barks isn't hurting anybody except for the peace of your neighborhood. A dog that is a nuisance animal because it has bitten is a whole much bigger deal. And so in the event that a dog bites another dog, the state won't allow you to declare it dangerous, but your local ordinance will. And so it does allow for that additional enforcement. So as we make those edits to the ordinance, we'll bring that back to you, but I did want to bring the bite case SOP, which was in your background, before you for consideration.
Thank you, Morgan. Does anybody have any questions?
I'm still kind of trying to, it's been a little bit of time before I've actually, since I've read the state rabies code in depth, but I'm just trying to get my head around why we're requiring, in the state rabies code, back when I read it, which is probably last time I read it full, it's probably about 7 years ago, because I, quite frankly, don't have too many true rabies concerns that really pop into the clinic on a monthly or yearly basis. That the only time that we would quarantine another animal that was exposed is if the animal was bitten by a possible rabid animal. So I don't understand, I guess, where this local ordinance is really coming into effect. It seems like it's potentially adding in more layers of legality that may not be needed per se as far as quarantining, but I would agree that dogs that have been repeat offenders or seriously gravely injured another dog and then they were off leash, not on their property, or especially on the victim dog's property, I could see where that would be relevant to maybe making them into a dangerous or nuisance animal. But I'm just still trying to wrap my head around why the city is differing that much on the rabies code on a state level versus a local level. And that's just kind of something that's, seems like that's maybe adding it's something that's not necessarily even done by the veterinarians, because quite frankly, we don't even report that, because that's not a dog on human bite, or even on that part. When we were taught in school, we weren't taught local codes, we were taught state level codes. And to be quite honest, it's kind of an odd code in the ordinance. So I'm going to be quite frankly, there's a lot of dog bites coming to the clinic that y'all have never even heard about. And I'm just kind of seeing that that's not even an enforced quarantine code to begin with. So why do and it's not even close to the code of the state code. So why is it in the books? So I guess that'd be something to look into.
And that's a good point. It's a common provision as I look at other ordinances for other cities that they do speak to something similar to what we're doing. And I believe the thought process is that the one way to prevent the spread of disease from animals to humans is to prevent the spread of disease from wildlife to domesticated animals. So we are treating dogs and cats most frequently in a quarantine situation at a much higher level than what you're describing. But that's the thought process behind it is we don't know if this dog was recently exposed to a skunk or a raccoon or whatever it may be. And so we're quarantining it as if we're being uber vigilant, perhaps is a way to wrap it up. But it's not uncommon across other cities to do so.
Okay. I guess my thing is that, we're not, I don't see that this is being utilized at all?
We see quite a few. But
Well,
I
we
understand
see
that there's
quite a
some
few too,
leakage,
so-
that there's some items not being reported to us in that way.
I don't know. I mean, to me, I think that reviewing that language, because I believe in the federal code, or not federal, but the state code, that if a wildlife animal bites another dog or cat or domesticated pet, and there's question about that, and there is no way to follow up, that animal is quarantined by 10 days, and that is in the state code. But I guess what I'm more getting at is, why do you want to quarantine the victim dog when you should probably just worry about quarantining the attacker? Because, to be honest with you, making the quarantine on the victim dog, who already probably has quite a hefty bill, maybe if the attacker dog shows no signs after 10 days of quarantine, then the victim dog does not need to be quarantined, because that was not an exposure to a rabid animal. If within those 10 days, the dog that attacked, that was the attacker, shows those signs, the victim dog would then be considered a rabies exposure risk, and then be, by state law, under rabies quarantine for the 10-day period from its bite. But I think that maybe it's putting too much undue burden onto our victims and receiving end parties, and maybe we should just put that all onto the offender's part, because I think that would be, one, a lot better for the public in general. It would also cut down on paperwork on the animal control side, and it would also make the victims of such attacks more likely to report them to you, because they won't have the threat of their own personal pet being quarantined.
Yes, sir. I think that's an opportunity we can absolutely explore in the revisions to the ordinance.
So just one question. As the ordinance is written now, if I am the owner of 2 dogs and those dogs get into a fight and there's injuries, that should be reported to animal control for quarantine?
If you have 2 animals and they get into a fight and they had any puncture wounds, a bite or a scratch, then yeah, it should be reported to animal control.
At all?
Yes, sir.
Do we have any public comment? There being none, we will move into number 5, follow-up and administrative issues. Update on planned training session for October the 19th, 2017.
I wanted to touch base with y'all. We had talked about having a training session to be administered by our city attorney to kind of touch base on things required in the law for this committee. And so we are slating that for October 19th. And we wanted to ensure that we were going to have a quorum for that. I think it'll be a really valuable dialogue with Ms. Teresa James.
During the normal time?
Correct. So it'll be at noon on October 19th instead of our normal meeting. So we'll call the meeting to order. We probably will still have consent agenda to consider the minutes, and then we'll go into workshop setting for the training for the duration of the meeting.
That will be at noon.
Correct. So we would consider our September numbers just at our next meeting. Any regular items we would consider, we'll just bump them.
Any questions? Update on regularly scheduled meeting for the November 16th, 2017.
We do have a planned agenda for November to talk about the monthly intake for September and October, but also to bring you our next SOP, which is over cruelty cases. That's the next one we've developed that we want to bring to y'all for consideration, but that is 7 days before Thanksgiving. We want to be respectful of everybody's holiday schedules. I do want to point out that the bylaws require us to meet 3 times a year, and of course we've already met that for the year. So in the event that it's the committee's pleasure to cancel, we can certainly bump items, but we would recommend still having our November meeting if y'all are able to do so.
I'll be there on Thursdays, except the week of Thanksgiving, so I don't have any plans, so.
As of now, we'll plan to have a November meeting.
Thank you.
All right, consider cancellation of December 21st meeting due to holiday scheduling.
So we would recommend, it's so difficult to get a quorum. So many people are traveling out of school already, those types of things. And so our December meeting would be traditionally held on December 21st. We think it's an opportunity to go ahead and just cancel that meeting. And then any new items that we would bring to you in January.
Do I have a motion to cancel the December meeting?
I motion that.
Second?
Second.
Okay, motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Our December meeting will be canceled.
Thank y'all.
All right. If there is any other business we need to discuss, any public comment at this point? Ask for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
A second.
All in favor? We are adjourned.